Welcome to International Biorenewables Law and Policy. This presentation is part 2 of our two-part series on indirect land use change and the food versus fuel debate. This presentation will focus on the food versus fuel debate and discuss some of the ethical questions surrounding whether we should use our land to produce fuel or food. The question of whether we should use our land to produce food versus fuel was debated heavily during the growth of the ethanol industry. Newspaper articles in particular questioned whether our ethanol producers were actually starving poor people in developing countries. Several articles came out pointing out some of the potential unethical questions surrounding biofuel. Here we see a comic showing how consumers of biofuels would be starving consumers around the world. On the right side, an even more clearer comic here suggesting that the West was taking bags of corn to produce biofuels and denying that food to starving kids in developing countries. Some people went as far as suggesting that biofuels were a crime against humanity. However, a lot of this anger towards biofuels came due to a rapid growth in food prices in 2007 and 2008. And this rapid growth, because it coincided with increasing production of biofuels became the culprit or suspected culprit of the rapid growth in food prices. Even grocers in the United States suggested that it was the ethanol industry that was devastating American families by causing them to pay more for food. When you look at historical food prices, it's one indicator that you could look into is, for example, the price of corn. Corn prices have historically averaged around $2 a bushel until 2006, when they started increasing in price up to $6 and even as far as almost $8 per bushel in 2012. Now, one question that you may have is why is this a concern? Well, let's start by looking at the efficiency of converting energy into the different kinds of key products in our food chain. If you start from the right side, beef production tends to be one of the most inefficient ways to get food in terms of energy. This is important, or this occurs because cattle in particular are in themselves are high energy consumers. And so the amount of energy it takes to produce a pound of beef is significantly more than what it takes to produce a pound of pork, for example, or a pound of chicken. As the world moves towards higher consumption of beef types of meat, the amount of land and energy that will be required to feed the population will increase. Now, ethanol, as has been said, also requires land and energy in order to produce. The efficiency to produce it is significantly greater than that to produce food, which suggests that it needs a significantly much smaller amount of land to produce ethanol than to produce a similar amount of energy in the form of food. However, this does not answer our question of whether we should produce food or fuel. But it's important to note that as we move from lower cost meats to a higher production of higher valued meat, we are also taking land away from growing staple foods that can produce a significant amount of nutrition from a smaller amount of land. But then let's look particularly at corn ethanol. Just like we did in the indirect land use change debate, we're going to try to plot ethanol production versus prices for these commodities. When you look at US corn prices, an increase in ethanol production does appear to have resulted in an increase in US corn prices, and this has been observed. Potential reasons for this are the same that we've discussed earlier, which are we're increasing competition for land. We're actually giving more value to farmers for some of that production, and so farmers can demand higher prices for their corn because there's a new competing market. However, this is only part of the effect. What is a little bit more difficult to follow, unless you're familiar with the food markets, is that a lot of the commodity foods that we produce today require a significant amount of fossil fuel input. And so the prices for these commodities tend to have a significant correlation with the price of oil. So if you look at the price of oil and you compare it to the price of several food indices, including corn, you'll see that many of the variations or rapid changes in the price of oil have resulted in corresponding changes in the price of different foods. But if we go back to the year or the period in time in which many of the newspaper articles were condemning the use of biofuel as a crime against humanity, you will find that the significant rise in prices that occurred during that year were due to a social panic that started in Vietnam and involved rice, a staple food that is consumed everywhere around the world by a significant population. What happened in 2007 to 2008 is that several countries, as depicted by this graphic, were expecting a much lower harvest of rice than they originally anticipated. This was due to several climatic impacts around the world, including droughts, including some weather events and heavy rains that resulted in a decrease in the amount of rice that was harvested. So leading up to the June harvest, you saw several countries such as Egypt and China and Saudi Arabia and Vietnam taking policy decisions that protected the local consumption of their rice production while limiting exports to countries that consume it. So, for example, Egypt restricted exports, and China added a tax on exports so that they could consume most of their rice locally. Saudi Arabia had to start importing rice from Thailand instead of India because India was restricting exports to Saudi Arabia on their rice. So all these different political and social changes led to a panic that increased the international price of rice. However, in June, when countries started harvesting their rice, they discovered that they actually had a record harvest. And because of that record harvest, the price of rice actually started decreasing, so that by the time we reached 2009, prices for rice were very close to their original levels. However, by this time, the damage had been done. This panic that led to an increase in the price of rice was eventually the news that biofuel deniers required to suggest that biofuels was causing starvation in developing countries. So to summarize, it is possible that biofuel production has a contributing factor to deforestation, to high food prices, and related to this, political social unrest in the developing world. However, when you look at the data, it's clear that there are many other influencing factors. And so while we can have to be careful that U.S. biofuel production does not lead directly to some of these problems, we also have to understand these in the wider context of an energy and food system that has been dominated by fossil fuels and that is transitioning into hopefully a cleaner and more sustainable type of energy.